They rose from nothing like financial conjurers, transforming raw materials into mansions that mimicked European palaces and social hierarchies that chased ancient aristocracy. For one brilliant moment, these self-made dynasties outshone their old-world counterparts, hosting extravagances where champagne fountains flowed while orchestras played in galleries designed by imported architects. Then came the falls, spectacular financial collapses, market panics, inheritance disputes, and tax regulations that devoured fortunes built across decades, leaving behind architectural white elephants too expensive for anyone to maintain. Today, we prove how the American aristocracy, perhaps, discovered its fatal weakness too late. Fortunes built on speculation, dissolving into bankruptcy notices and auction catalogues, and transforming dynasty founders from financial wizards into historical footnotes within single generations. When you think of the Gilded Age, your mind conjures images of marble ballrooms and champagne fountains, of corseted ladies gliding across polished floors while gentlemen in tailcoats discuss railroad stocks. Indeed, it's a romanticized tableau of American aristocracy, refined, dignified, proper. But behind the velvet curtains of one $350 million Gilded Age fortune lurked a dynasty that shattered this pristine facade. You see, the Singer sewing machine empire wasn't just built on sewing machines, it was constructed from the contradictions of American capitalism itself. From a failed actor who revolutionized global industry but couldn't maintain a single household, to a lesbian princess who transformed modern music while hiding in a marriage of convenience. Then there's the family playboy who built America's playground for the ultra-wealthy only to die penniless and forgotten, and their palatial European villas which became Nazi headquarters while their global investments were seized by communists. In today's episode of Old Money Luxury, we won't be sharing the sanitized Gilded Age of period dramas. Here, prepare to enter the raw, unvarnished saga of how one of history's greatest fortunes vanished so completely that today's billionaires barely remember their cautionary tale. The sewing machine empire that clothed millions began with a failed actor who couldn't even stitch together a decent Hamlet. In 1811, baby Isaac Singer entered a world where every garment required 60 hours of hand-stitching. Born to a German Jewish father who had cleverly amputated his surname Reisinger to Singer upon fleeing to America. Fate's first cruel stitch came when 8-year-old Isaac watched his mother Ruth pack her bags in 1821, divorcing his father and abandoning her son, the first in a lifetime of fractured attachments. The boy fled at 12 when his stepmother's regime became unbearable, escaping to Rochester, where his brother reluctantly taught him metalworking. Mechanical knowledge the theater-obsessed youth absorbed while dreaming of spotlights, not sewing machines. Isaac's quest for theatrical glory collapsed when critics mocked his wooden performances, though the touring life delivered a consolation prize in seamstress Mary Ann Sponsler, the first woman in a portfolio that would eventually include 5 partners and 24 children. When his acting troupe imploded in 1839, Singer found himself sleeping in repair shops across the Midwest, watching his dreams dissolve into desperate mechanical tinkering, rock bottom for a man who would soon rival Rockefeller in wealth. Salvation arrived in 1851 in a Boston repair shop when Singer encountered a clunky Lero and Blodgett machine that barely stitched without jamming. In 11 feverish days, he reimagined it with a vertical plunger, foot treadle, and tension mechanism. Revolutionary changes unlocking 900 stitches per minute when competitors managed barely 40. The invention unleashed an industrial hurricane. Singer partnered with legal fox Edward Clark to neutralize patent challenges, pioneered installment plans and door-to-door demonstrations, and built factories across 3 continents, capturing 40% of global markets by 1860. At retirement in 1863, Singer commanded $13 million, roughly $350 million today, while his company held 22 patents and generated annual revenues exceeding $22 million, staggering success for a man who once begged for repair work. Behind his triumph lurked a tangle of overlapping families that spawned decades of inheritance litigation, as Singer maintained multiple households simultaneously, creating a dynasty as complicated as his machine's internal mechanisms. The Needle's revenge was complete. The failed performer who couldn't sew together a theatrical career had stitched his name into industrial history while creating a family that couldn't stay stitched together. Isaac Singer's production line of children operated with greater efficiency than his sewing machine factories ever achieved. His first manufacturing attempt began at 19 when he married 15-year-old Catherine Maria Haley, quickly producing 2 children before abruptly shutting down that facility to join the Baltimore Strolling Players, discarding his teenage wife like a defective prototype. While still legally bound to Catherine, Singer unveiled a second production model in 1836, establishing a 25-year partnership with Mary Ann Sponsler that yielded 10 children. A shadow family maintained in increasingly luxurious settings as his mechanical inventions began generating serious capital. Quality control issues emerged when Mary Ann spotted her common-law husband parading down Fifth Avenue with factory employee Mary McGonigal, triggering a spectacular malfunction that culminated in Singer's arrest for bigamy and emergency evacuation to London in 1862. System diagnostics revealed a previously undisclosed production unit. A third wife, Mary Eastwood Walters, a company demonstrator who had produced a daughter in Lower Manhattan, creating a multi-branch family tree that would confound generations of probate lawyers. By 1860, Singer's human assembly line had manufactured 20 children, 16 still operational, by 4 different women, a biological output exceeding his patented mechanical inventions in both number and complexity. The 50-year-old industrialist's final manufacturing plant opened in Paris, connecting with 19-year-old Isabella Eugénie Boyer, who abandoned her husband to marry Singer in 1863 while already pregnant with the first of 6 additional children. This final production run yielded the Singer dynasty's most distinctive models: Winnaretta, the lesbian princess who revolutionized modern music, and Paris, the playboy developer who transformed Palm Beach into America's most exclusive resort. Singer's 1863 will distributed his $13 million fortune with glaring favoritism. $500,000 to Isabella, $3 million to their children, modest trusts to 14 others, and an insulting $500 to son William, punished for supporting his mother during divorce proceedings. The subsequent legal battles began in 1877, when Mary Ann's children sued Isabella's heirs, and continued into the 1920s. Decades of litigation consuming millions while providing the only genuine interaction between Singer's scattered offspring. When Singer's production line permanently shut down in 1875, his funeral featured 80 horse-drawn carriages and 2,000 mourners as workers lowered his body into Torquay Cemetery within 3 sequential coffins. The sewing machine magnate who specialized in connecting separate pieces died, leaving a family that would remain permanently disconnected, destined to unravel the fortune that might have bound them together. Of all Isaac Singer's offspring, daughter Winnaretta emerged as the most fascinatingly contradictory: an industrial heiress who championed avant-garde music, a princess who rejected men, and a millionaire who built housing for the poor. Born in 1865 to Isabella Boyer, Winnaretta absorbed the opulence of Oldway Mansion in England, developing a passion for cutting-edge music that would have bewildered her profit-minded father, and a determination to live openly as a lesbian in an era when such preferences remained unmentionable in polite society. Her first concession to convention came at 22 when she married Prince Louis de Montbéliard, a union that imploded spectacularly on their wedding night when the bride reportedly scaled a bedroom armoire like a besieged fortress, brandishing a weapon and informing her groom that approaching her would result in his immediate dispatch to the afterlife. The Catholic Church graciously annulled this unconsummated disaster 5 years later, freeing Winnaretta to craft a more workable arrangement in 1893 when, at 28, she married 59-year-old Prince Edmond de Polignac, a gay composer seeking similar social camouflage, creating what Parisians called a mariage blanc, built on musical collaboration rather than bedroom compatibility. Now bearing the title Princesse de Polignac, Winnaretta transformed her Avenue Henri Martin mansion into a revolutionary musical incubator where Debussy, Ravel, Fauré and Chabrier premiered compositions that would reshape 20th century sound. The mechanical drone of her father's sewing machines replaced by the startling harmonies of musical modernism. The composer Ravel honored her patronage by dedicating his haunting Pavane pour un enfant défunt to the princesse, while Marcel Proust soaked in the atmosphere of her legendary salon, later transmuting these experiences into passages of his monumental In Search of Lost Time. Throughout her marriage and after her husband's death, Winnaretta conducted affairs with numerous women without pretense of secrecy. Her lovers included painter Romaine Brooks, composer Ethel Smith, and novelist Violet Trefusis, creating occasional public scenes as when one spurned husband shouted outside her palazzo, "If you are half the man I think you are, you will come out here and fight me." After Prince Edmund's death, Winnaretta deployed her inheritance to commission groundbreaking works from Stravinsky, Satie, Milhaud, Poulenc, and Weill. Musical investments that yielded greater cultural dividends than any stock portfolio could have matched. Beyond music, Winnaretta defied expectations of self-indulgence by developing model housing for Paris's working poor in 1911 and collaborating with Le Corbusier on Salvation Army shelters for the homeless, progressive social projects that would have puzzled her ruthlessly capitalist father. During World War I, the princess partnered with Marie Curie to convert luxury limousines into mobile radiology units for treating wounded soldiers, while in the interwar period she funded the 360-bed Foch Hospital for middle-class workers, practical philanthropy that contrasted sharply with her half-brother Paris's pleasure palaces in Florida. The lesbian princess who had transformed sewing machine millions into musical revolution and social reform represented the Singer fortune's most productive metamorphosis, industrial wealth transfigured into cultural and humanitarian achievement. Her carefully constructed world of artistic patronage and same-sex relationships seemed a fortress secure against conventional society's disapproval. But even princesses with millions couldn't withstand the coming storm of jackboots and swastikas. As fascism's shadow lengthened across Europe, no aristocratic title or family fortune could protect what Winnaretta had built. Merritt Singer, Isaac's 22nd child, translated his inheritance into architectural fantasies that transformed Florida's mosquito-infested coastline into America's playground for the ultra-wealthy. Born in his namesake city in 1867 to Isabella Boyer, Paris possessed his father's confidence without his work ethic, skipping out of Cambridge University without a degree. Academic failure that hardly mattered when $3 million inheritance dollars, $80 million today, awaited his 18th birthday. Standing 6'4" with what architect Addison Misner described as the finest-looking man I ever saw, straight as a die with a fine figure, Paris mechanically checked marriage off his to-do list by acquiring Australian-born Cecilia Lily Graham, who dutifully produced 5 children before discovering her husband's interests lay elsewhere. His defining passion emerged through a tempestuous affair with legendary dancer Isadora Duncan, whose revolutionary barefoot performances had scandalized conventional audiences and whose artistic vision Paris enthusiastically bankrolled, an investment in cultural disruption his industrialist father would have found bewildering. The relationship produced a son, Patrick, in 1910, only to collapse in tragedy when the 3-year-old boy drowned in 1913, a devastating loss that reportedly accelerated Duncan's psychological deterioration and terminated their romance. Paris's transformation from playboy to placemaker began in 1917 when he encountered architect Addison Misner, a fortuitous meeting that Misner later credited as the cause of my existence for the next 10 years, launching a partnership that would reshape American resort architecture. When Paris brought Misner to Palm Beach in 1918, the architect's first assignment was converting Singer's unremarkable villa into the exotic Chinese Villa, a project that demonstrated Misner's ability to conjure fantasy environments that wealthy Americans found irresistible. Their grandest collaboration emerged from Paris's desire to build a veterans' hospital, but with the war's end, the nearly completed facility was repurposed as the Everglades Club, immediately establishing itself as the epicenter of Palm Beach society and the blueprint for America's exclusive resort culture. As Everglades Club president, Paris resided in a custom apartment while developing increasingly ambitious plans for nearby Singer Island, including the Blue Heron Hotel, designed to be the most extravagant resort in North America and connected to the mainland by an aerial ferry with 12 cable cars suspended 136 feet above water. The Florida real estate collapse of 1926 shattered these dreams, forcing the Everglades Club into receivership as Paris found himself unable to service the massive loans he had secured using the club as collateral. Ultimate humiliation arrived in April 1928 when Palm Beach authorities arrested Singer at his own club on real estate fraud charges. And though a judge dismissed the case 3 weeks later, the public embarrassment so thoroughly destroyed his standing that he immediately fled the paradise he had created, never to return. The 1929 crash demolished what remained of his fortune, forcing the former social lion to spend his final years in a modest house in France with his wife and former nurse, Joan Balch. Dramatic come-down for a man who once commissioned buildings that defined American luxury. Paris Singer died in London in 1932, leaving behind the ultimate irony. The Everglades Club, Palm Beach society, and the Mediterranean revival style that defines Florida's Gold Coast, enduring monuments to a man who lost everything pursuing architectural immortality. As Palm Beach socialites sipped cocktails in the Misner-designed spaces Paris had bankrolled, the empire's creator died broke and forgotten, a cautionary tale written in stucco and red tile roofs. None of the scattered Singer heirs could have imagined that their family properties in Europe were about to face dangers far beyond mere bankruptcy. The 1929 market crash struck the first devastating blow to the Singer family fortune, transforming Paris's Mediterranean playground, the Hotel Carlton in Cannes, from champagne-soaked retreat to echoing mausoleum overnight. His Blue Heron Hotel, intended as America's most lavish resort, now loomed over Singer Island like an abandoned skeleton, silent testimony to ambition outrunning financial gravity until wrecking balls finally erased the embarrassment in 1940. For Princess Winnaretta in Paris, economic catastrophe threatened her musical patronage, though her aristocratic determination kept crucial social projects running. Her Salvation Army shelters continued housing the desperate, while her Foch Hospital treated middle-class patients even as bank failures multiplied. The Depression, however devastating, merely foreshadowed the existential threat approaching the Singer dynasty. Nazi jackboots that would trample not just their finances, but their physical legacy across Europe. When German forces occupied France, they systematically targeted properties owned by wealthy Jews, Americans and aristocrats. The Singer family portfolio offering a perfect trifecta of confiscation targets. The Belle Époque Villa Nelcote in Villefranche-sur-Mer was commandeered as regional Gestapo headquarters, its elegant rooms repurposed for interrogations, while officers planned deportations from balconies overlooking the Mediterranean. In Paris, the Gestapo seized the Singer-Polignac mansion, auctioning portions of its priceless art collection, musical scores, paintings and sculptures Winnaretta had spent decades assembling to fund the Nazi war machine. Singer trusts and investments in Germany vaporized under Aryanization policies, transferring generations of careful financial planning into Reich coffers with bureaucratic efficiency. Decades later, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger recording "Exile on Main Site." At Villa Nelcote, discovered basement ventilation grills still bearing swastika insignia, lingering evidence of rooms where Nazi officers had once plotted atrocities. Meanwhile, in Russia, Singer's pre-revolutionary subsidiary had long since been nationalized, the family's eastern flank erased by communism, while its western holdings faced fascist expropriation. War's end brought little relief, as Singer heirs discovered their European trusts depleted, properties damaged, and art collections scattered, beginning futile decades-long quests through legal systems ill-equipped to deliver justice. The Nazi theft demonstrated how quickly the mightiest fortune could be erased when political forces turned against its owners, a vulnerability that even Isaac's mechanical genius couldn't have anticipated. What Hitler's forces had begun, the relentless mathematics of inheritance and taxation would complete. The post-war era delivered the coup de grace to whatever remained of the Singer fortune, as revenue-hungry tax authorities descended like financial vultures upon family trusts that war had already picked clean. IRS agents slapped liens on American-based Singer assets, forcing panic-stricken fire sales of properties that might have regenerated the family's wealth had they been held through post-war prosperity. Short-term government gain producing permanent dynastic loss. Meanwhile, the once mighty Singer Corporation watched helplessly as its global market share withered to 15% by 1963. Asian competitors using Isaac's own production innovations with lower labor costs to undercut the company he had built. Brand desperation manifested in licensing deals for products Isaac would never have recognized: kitchen toasters, furniture, hunting rifles. As the manufacturing colossus that once dominated global markets reduced itself to renting its famous name to anybody willing to write a check. By 1986, the corporate transformation was complete. Singer Corporation abandoned sewing machines entirely for aerospace and military technology, severing the final thread connecting the company to its founder's vision. Princess Winnareta's cultural patronage proved more durable than her father's financial empire. The pre-Singer Polignac still recognizes musical achievement, while compositions she commissioned now form the standard repertoire of classical orchestras worldwide. In Palm Beach, Paris Singer's architectural vision endures through the Everglades Club and the Mediterranean revival style that defines Florida's Gold Coast. Though cocktail-sipping socialites remain blissfully unaware, they owe their playground to a man who died broke and forgotten. The Singer name achieved unlikely immortality in St. Petersburg, where the House of Singer survived Soviet nationalization to become one of the city's beloved bookstores, its distinctive glass globe still silently proclaiming Singer's global ambitions decades after the family's financial collapse. While Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, and other industrial dynasties preserved significant wealth through strategic diversification and political adaptation, the Singer fortune evaporated more completely. Scattered through poor investments, family feuds, geopolitical misfortune, and failure to evolve. Isaac Singer's 24 documented children scattered his DNA widely, but ultimately failed to preserve his fortune, producing hundreds of descendants who today live with little connection to the industrial empire that once bore their name. Today, vintage Singer sewing machines gather dust in attics across America, mechanical ghosts of a vanished empire whose name once ranked alongside Rockefeller and Carnegie, but whose fortune proved as fragile as the thread it helped sew. The image of the eccentric billionaire haunts American culture. Titans who plaster their names across skylines, competing to build the most luxurious towers and go the farthest into space. Indeed, their wealth screams for attention. And yet, buried in Manhattan's tumultuous real estate history, lies a fortune that deliberately erased itself from public view. See, the Wendel family controlled an empire rivaling the Rockefellers themselves, but refused to announce their existence to the world around them. And while Vanderbilts hosted lavish galas and Carnegies built libraries, this shadowy clan engineered a financial kingdom based on refusal. Refusing modernization, refusing visibility, refusing the very century they inhabited. Soon, the fortune that should have liberated them instead imprisoned them, warping their minds until wealth and madness became indistinguishable. Thus, in today's episode of Old Money Luxury, we unravel America's most psychologically disturbing dynasty, the billionaires who chose invisibility and paid for it with their sanity as we describe the Gilded Age family that went insane, the downfall of the Wendel dynasty. In the shadow of Manhattan's gleaming Art Deco spires stood an architectural anachronism that defied the relentless march of progress. The four-story brownstone at 442 Fifth Avenue remained frozen in the 1850s, while skyscrapers grew around it like crystalline forests. Gas lamps flickered in windows framed by iron bars, their amber glow a stubborn rebellion against Edison's electric grid that powered the surrounding metropolis. This was no ordinary mansion, but the fortress headquarters of New York's most confusing dynasty, the Wendels, whose wealth rivaled the Rockefellers, yet whose lifestyle belonged to another century altogether. The Wendel saga began with Johann Georg Wendel's immigration to New York around 1710, part of the Palatine migration that would seed America's economic aristocracy. By 1801, his descendant John G. Wendel I had established a thriving operation that capitalized on New York's strategic position as the nexus of the North American fur trade. The family's enterprise functioned within the triangular economics of colonial commerce. European manufacturers supplied trade goods to colonial merchants, who exchanged them with indigenous trappers for furs, which then shipped to European markets at profit margins exceeding 300%. When declining fur stocks in the Northeast and the rising popularity of silk hats eroded the trade's profitability in the 1830s, the Wendels executed a pivot that would ultimately create a fortune worth over $2 billion in today's currency. John G. Wendel I began acquiring Manhattan properties in the 1820s, focusing on undeveloped lots north of settled areas, with the prescient understanding that the island's constraints would inevitably push development northward. His investment strategy paralleled the frontier speculation model of the fur trade, identifying undervalued assets in territories positioned for explosive growth. Between 1790 and 1850, New York's population erupted from 33,000 to 696,000 souls, creating unprecedented demand for housing and commercial space. The completion of the Croton Aqueduct in 1845 solved Manhattan's freshwater crisis, enabling the dense urban development that would make the Wendels' strategic landholdings multiply in value exponentially each decade. In 1856, the family established their iconic mansion at 442 Fifth Avenue, constructed for $150,000, equivalent to $5.3 million today. This imposing red brick brownstone occupied a 100 by 100-foot plot at the corner of 39th Street, serving as both family residence and the symbolic command center of their expanding real estate empire. The 40-room structure would remain largely unchanged for 75 years, becoming increasingly incongruous as Manhattan's architectural landscape transformed around it. While the Vanderbilts erected palatial mansions and corporate interests built ever taller skyscrapers, the Wendels maintained their fortress with stubborn resistance to modernization. By 1910, it would be the last private residence in Midtown, surrounded by hotels and commercial buildings whose owners repeatedly offered millions for the prime location. When John G. Wendel I died in 1859, the family fortune stood at approximately $3 million, equivalent to $110 million today, primarily invested in 92% unimproved land and aging residential buildings. His passing triggered a succession crisis that would unleash his son's pathological need for control and transform 6 women into prisoners of their own inheritance. John G. Wendel II's appointment as executor in 1871 marked the beginning of a domestic regime that would subjugate his 6 sisters, Rebecca, Georgiana, Ella, Augusta, Josephine, and Mary, for decades to come. Unlike many Gilded Age patriarchs who wielded financial power through corporate boardrooms, Wendel engineered his control through an intimate architecture of familial imprisonment. His first maneuver exploited 19th-century coverture laws that treated married women's assets as their husband's property, forcing his sisters to sign legally dubious spinster agreements that would forfeit their inheritance rights upon marriage. The mansion at 442 Fifth Avenue became the physical manifestation of this control, with the sisters housed in shared bedrooms on upper floors, while Wendel occupied the ground floor with direct street access, a spatial hierarchy that reinforced his dominance. To prevent external influences, he hired tutors to educate his sisters with curricula focused on property law and ledger keeping rather than liberal arts, creating a captive managerial class dependent on his approval. The psychological impact of this domestic tyranny manifested in the sisters' maladaptive behaviors, including Georgiana's documented hoarding of 412 moth-eaten dresses, none newer than 1870s fashions. Following their mother's death in 1872, the sisters wore only black bombazine, yet paradoxically spent $12,000 annually, equivalent to $360,000 today, on Brussels lace trim. Wendel enforced a financial lockdown that sequestered all tenant payments into trust accounts, requiring unanimous sibling consent for withdrawals, a structure later ruled illegal in the 1915 court case in Re Wendel. His architectural containment strategy intensified after 1892 anarchist bombings near neighboring Astor properties, when he installed wrought iron window bars and constructed a 12-foot perimeter wall studded with iron spikes. The mansion stood defiantly against modernization, rejecting Edison's 1882 electrical grid connection purportedly to prevent sisters' exposure to degenerate media, like telephones. Despite receiving $2.3 million in annual rental income, household budgets capped food at $18 weekly, less than their doorman's salary. Wendel himself exhibited peculiar behaviors, wearing platform shoes with inch-thick soles to protect against disease entering through his feet, a detail that highlighted his paranoia. Rebecca Wendel, the eldest sister, staged the family's only successful rebellion at age 60, marrying Lutheran minister Luther Swope in 1903. Their correspondence reveals a startling duality. Rebecca publicly decried marriage as a bourgeois trap, while secretly amassing a trousseau over 3 decades. Swope's 1912 letter to Ella exposed the marriage's transactional nature. "Your sister required proof I'd renounce any claim to Wendel assets. I signed gladly, for love needs no ledger." Georgiana Wendel's psychological deterioration resulted in institutionalization at Bellevue Asylum in 1899 after she sued Wendel for $50,000 in withheld inheritance. Her case files diagnose hysterical neurosis stemming from prolonged emotional malnutrition, with treatment including forced embroidery sessions producing tapestries of Fifth Avenue properties. By the time John G. Wendel II died in 1914, his sisters had so thoroughly internalized their captivity that they continued the same lifestyle without rebellion. The 6 Wendel sisters, now aging spinsters in their 60s and 70s, maintained their Victorian dress and gaslit lifestyle, while the city around them embraced automobiles, electric appliances, and the dawning jazz age. Their collective decision to perpetuate their brothers' eccentric practices, rather than embrace freedom, revealed the profound psychological damage wrought by decades of control, a Stockholm syndrome that would manifest in their obsessive attachment to a succession of pedigreed poodles who received more care than their human tenants. As Manhattan entered the Roaring Twenties, the Wendel sisters' peculiar attachment to their poodles transcended ordinary pet ownership and became a displacement mechanism for their thwarted maternal instincts. Ella Wendel, who would become the last surviving sibling, lavished extraordinary attention on a succession of French poodles all named Toby, creating a canine dynasty that stood in stark contrast to the human lineage her brother had deliberately terminated. Each poodle received a jeweled collar worth $15,000, equivalent to $360,000 in today's currency, while the sisters themselves wore patched undergarments and refused modern conveniences. When a Toby died, the ritual mourning included a velvet-lined casket and formal burial in the Irvington Pet Cemetery, with meticulous succession planning that ensured the next Toby inherited the previous dog's royal accoutrements. The backyard of their Fifth Avenue mansion became known as the $1 Million Dog Run, a 2,500-square-foot urban oasis featuring a heated kennel with stained glass windows depicting ancestral Wendel estates. Developers repeatedly offered $1.5 million for this prime Manhattan real estate in 1927, but Ella refused, citing Toby XIV's constitutional needs as taking precedence over commercial opportunities. The sisters' summer residence in Irvington, New York, offered a parallel universe of eccentric behaviors, where they maintained Ayrshire cows despite documented lactose intolerance. Georgiana's diary notes, "Milk pours to troughs while we take tea." Their 50-room cottage contained its own contradictions. No telephone service until 1928, when fire marshals mandated emergency lines. Yet walls that, when X-rayed in 2001, revealed gold leaf beneath peeling wallpaper. For 7 decades, the Wendels locked their Fifth Avenue mansion each summer to live in Irvington, where they kept livestock and maintained a kitchen garden. Manual labor that seemed incongruous with their wealth and urban reclusiveness. The family's 200 apple trees produced cider vinegar for cleaning, not consumption, with harvests reportedly left to rot ceremonially each autumn to feed the soil's humours. Irish immigrant labourers employed from 1870 through 1931 described the sisters hand-washing linens in the Hudson River for character building, despite their immense wealth. While the Wendels treated their poodles like royalty, the human residents of their approximately 150 Manhattan properties endured deplorable conditions that eventually attracted the attention of health authorities and housing reformers. The 1901 Tenement House Act inspections exposed the consequences of the family's no repairs policy, when investigators found 72% of Wendel rental units lacking ventilation or running water compared to 53% citywide. By 1910, tuberculosis rates in Wendel properties had reached 300% above Manhattan's average, creating a public health crisis directly attributable to their neglect. Buildings like 87 Orchard Street exemplified the decline. 1/3 of children born in Wendel tenements between 1905 and 1910 did not survive to age 5. The family's reputation transformed from merely eccentric to actively predatory through exposés like Upton Sinclair's 1927 piece, The House of Closed Shutters, which galvanized tenant unions against what he termed Wendel slumlords. When the last Toby died in 1933, his taxidermied remains sparked a legal battle between Drew University, a beneficiary of the Wendel estate, and the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, resolved by displaying him under glass in Mead Hall until a 1944 fire. The jarring contrast between the jewel-collared, pampered poodles and the suffering tenants became symbolic of the Wendels' twisted relationship with wealth, the capacity to provide comfort and security deployed selectively for canines while humans suffered. Ella Wendel's 1921 diary encapsulated this dissonance. Mr. Rockefeller's razing of the old Baptist tabernacle proves the transience of worldly things. This cognitive disconnect between accumulating vast wealth while living in calculated squalor would establish the groundwork for the family's ultimate economic downfall. An empire built on strategic neglect cannot indefinitely defy the forces of urban progress and regulatory reform. The Wendel family's investment philosophy crystallized under John G. Wendel II into what real estate historians would later term the Wendel Doctrine, a counterintuitive approach to wealth management that defied conventional capitalism. At its core lay 4 ironclad principles that transformed neglect into a perversely effective business model. No mortgages, no sales, no repairs, and strategic uptown migration. The first commandment, purchasing all properties outright with cash reserves and avoiding interest payments, insulated the family from financial upheavals that devastated leveraged investors during the panics of 1873 and 1893. Their absolute prohibition on divestment created a compounding effect. As Manhattan land values appreciated at 7% annually from 1850 to 1900, allowing their portfolio to grow from 112 properties in 1900 to 150 by 1910. The most controversial aspect, minimal maintenance of buildings, reduced operating costs while exploiting New York's chronic housing shortage, which ensured tenant demand despite deteriorating conditions. This calculated neglect reached its nadir when buildings like the infamous tenement at 87 Orchard Street received only emergency repairs, creating what housing reformers dubbed vertical cholera farms in the immigrant-dense Lower East Side. Their uptown migration strategy, acquiring properties 10 blocks north of current premium zones every decade, positioned them to profit from Midtown's emergence as a business district in the 1910s. The family's crown jewel remained their Fifth Avenue mansion, occupying a 100 by 100-foot plot valued at $1.5 million in 1931, $30 million today. The property exemplified their philosophy of holding prime land while forgoing income maximization, a stance that became increasingly irrational as skyscrapers rose around them, including the Empire State Building completed in 1931. Their eccentric lifestyle choices functioned as visible manifestations of their business philosophy. The sisters, hanging patched undergarments on a rooftop clothesline, visible to the Waldorf Astoria's penthouse guests, served as performance art, declaring their rejection of consumer culture. Rebecca Wendel's Friday ritual of riding the 6th Avenue L to Washington Market to bargain for day-old bread while wearing a moth-eaten 1870s crinoline dramatized their contempt for the nouveau riche who flaunted consumption. Despite receiving $2.3 million yearly in rental income, the mansion's thermometers rarely rose above 55 degrees Fahrenheit in winter. Chill preserves virtue, John II had declared in 1895 correspondence. Ironically, this self-imposed austerity masked immense hidden wealth. Ella's 1907 ledger shows 12 cents spent on codfish versus $18,000 annually for poodle grooming. The Wendel approach created a self-reinforcing cycle. Rental income from downtown properties funded uptown acquisitions, while tax benefits from depreciating buildings offset rental revenues. Their 1905 battle against eminent domain for the Hudson Terminal project revealed the strategy's legal dimensions, spending $20,000, equivalent to $650,000 today, to retain a $75,000 property established precedents in land use law. However, this model contained inherent contradictions that became increasingly untenable as Manhattan modernized. Their resistance to transit development, evidenced by blocking interborough rapid transit subway access to 28th Street in 1904, reduced foot traffic to their garment district holdings and sacrificed $12 million in potential retail income in today's value. The 1916 setback laws rendered their full-block buildings functionally obsolete, yet no retrofits occurred despite changing market demands. Their maintenance of 1850s-era fire policies without inflation riders led to $1.8 million in unrecovered losses in the aftermath of the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. By the 1920s, while competitors like the Astors embraced steel frame construction and electric elevators, the Wendels clung to outmoded building designs and amenities, with their unimproved lots becoming liabilities under new zoning regulations. The approach that had protected them from earlier financial panics left them vulnerable to a perfect storm of regulatory changes, market evolution, and taxation reforms that would threaten the very foundations of their peculiar empire. When Ella Wendel died on March 15, 1931, the last guardian of Manhattan's strangest dynasty left behind a vacuum that nature and the legal system rushed to fill with unprecedented ferocity. As the sole surviving sibling, Ella had reluctantly managed the family's 150 properties through the onset of the Great Depression, watching vacancy rates in their financial district buildings reach 45% by 1932. Her death unleashed what the New York Times called the most extraordinary inheritance battle in the city's history, a legal feeding frenzy involving 2,303 claimants to an estate valued at $100 million, equivalent to $2.1 billion today. The claimants ranged from alleged secret love children to distant cousins, each armed with elaborate genealogies, forged diaries, ancestral daguerreotypes, and dramatic testimonials about their connection to the Wendel bloodline. Among the more colorful pretenders was Martha Schroeder, who claimed to be the daughter of Wendell II's secret 1880s affair with a family maid, complete with documentation of an exile to Santa Monica under the alias Mrs. Holweddell, with a $5,000 annual stipend. The court proceedings revealed the existence of John Jr., purportedly hidden through elaborate protocols, including a craftsman bungalow with a secret basement apartment for Wendel II's visits. Claims later supported by genetic testing showing a 99.98% paternity match. The legal battle culminated in 1933 when surrogate James A. Foley approved a settlement granting over $2 million to 9 distant relatives, effectively acknowledging the legitimate branches of the family tree while dismissing thousands of spurious claims. Beyond the human drama, the estate faced an existential threat from tax authorities. The 1922 reforms had imposed 25% levies on undistributed trust income, forcing the first breach of the never sell dogma. The estate's tax bill necessitated the unthinkable, liquidating significant portions of the portfolio that had been accumulated over a century and preserved through the family's pathological resistance to divestment. This forced sale transformed Manhattan's physical landscape as Wendel properties became available for development after decades of artificial constraint, with parcels eventually incorporated into landmarks like Rockefeller Center and sites that would later host modern skyscrapers. The mansion at 442 Fifth Avenue, once valued at $1.5 million in 1931, was ultimately raised for a $4.2 million office tower developed by Drew University, one of the charitable beneficiaries of the estate. This redevelopment yielded a 58% annualized return by 1941, compared to the Wendel's historical 2.3% yield, a posthumous rebuke to their antiquated business model. The remaining estate was split among 5 charitable organizations, marking the final dissolution of a dynasty that had once controlled vast swaths of prime Manhattan real estate through a philosophy of deliberate inaction. The taxidermied remains of Toby XIV, the last in the line of pampered poodles, found their way to the Museum of the City of New York, a macabre memento of a family whose priorities had placed canine comfort above human welfare. The legal precedent established in the 1933 Matter of Wendel case continues to influence inheritance law, reportedly blocking 43% of contested claims in New York courts to this day. Architectural traces of the Wendel legacy have been almost completely erased from Manhattan's physical landscape. No plaques commemorate their holdings, no buildings bear their name, and few New Yorkers recognize the dynasty that once controlled their city block by block. What remains instead is a cautionary tale of wealth preservation taken to pathological extremes. The family that refused to build, improve, or adapt ultimately lost everything to the very forces of progress they had resisted. Their once imposing Fifth Avenue mansion, which famously lacked electricity while skyscrapers rose around it, became, ironically, a parking garage before its demolition, the ultimate symbol of a dynasty that refused to evolve and was subsequently paved over by modernity. The Wendels' resistance to change, embodied in gaslighting, Victorian dress, and primitive plumbing, proved no match for the inexorable forces of urban development, tax reform, and generational transition. In the final accounting, the empire that John G. Wendel II had preserved through psychological manipulation, architectural containment, and financial lockdown strategies disintegrated within 2 years of Ella's death, proving that fortunes built on stasis cannot withstand the hurricane forces of change in America's most dynamic city. Picture yourself standing before an architectural marvel on New York's Riverside Drive, where a palace worthy of European royalty once commanded the Manhattan skyline. This was no ordinary mansion, but rather a testament to one man's audacious dream, a 75-room Renaissance chateau that cost an astronomical $7 million in 1906, equivalent to over $200 million today. And this architectural triumph, with its gold-leafed ceilings, private art gallery, and 3-story pipe organ, stood as a monument to America's first age of excess. This was Riverside, the home of Charles M. Schwab, a man whose rise from mill worker to steel titan embodied the American dream. In the glittering realm of America's Gilded Age, where titans like Carnegie and Morgan reigned supreme, Schwab carved his own empire with theatrical flair. As the first president of U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation, he commanded an annual salary of $100,000 and a bonus of $1 million. Yet beneath the shimmer of success lay a tale of dramatic decline. He spent money like water, hosting lavish parties with champagne flowing, maintaining a fleet of yachts, and building palatial residences that could rival European aristocrats. His appetite for opulence stretched from his summer estate in Loretto, Pennsylvania, to grand philanthropic gestures that seemed more theatrical productions than charity. In today's episode, we'll explore the remarkable rise and tragic fall of Charles M. Schwab, from Pennsylvania's steel mills to a legacy lost, as the excesses of a gilded life faded into mere memories. He seemingly had it all, a fortune that would make today's billionaires raise their perfectly manicured eyebrows. Indeed, at his family's peak, Charles M. Schwab sat atop a staggering $40 billion empire in modern money, a sum that plants him firmly among America's Gilded Age titans. But it's how he flaunted it that would truly capture the attention. For example, his piece de resistance was the absolutely magnificent Riverside Mansion in Manhattan. A $200 million, in today's currency, icon of excess, this architectural marvel commandeers an entire city block on Riverside Drive. We're talking 75 rooms of pure French chateau opulence, complete with a Gothic chapel that would make Notre Dame blush and marble staircases that practically demand a grand entrance. The Palm Court accommodated 300 of society's finest, and the original Rodins graced the corridors like common decorations, while priceless European masterpieces adorn walls as casually as family photos. Furthermore, the ballroom, dripping in gold leaf and crystal, served as the stage where America's industrial royalty performs their social dance. But that's merely the city residence. Let's hop over to Immergrün, his summer sanctuary in Loretto, Pennsylvania. This 44-room countryside palace sprawled across 400 acres of what can only be described as botanical perfection. Indoor swimming pool, naturally, private theatre, but of course, bowling alley. Would you expect anything less? The man maintained a collection of properties that would make a real estate mogul weep. Hunting lodges in New Jersey, coastal retreats, urban investments that read like a Monopoly champion's portfolio. His yacht, Loretto, demanded $300,000 annually just for upkeep. That's the price of some people's homes, mind you. Yet beneath this cathedral of consumption lied a surprisingly generous heart. Loretto transformed under his patronage. Schools rose, churches appeared, infrastructure materialized. His charitable gifts matched his personal indulgences, dollar for dollar, funding everything from public libraries to technical schools, particularly in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Thus, it is heartbreaking to see the downfall of such an iconic man, who also happened to grow up with humble immigrant roots, as we'll see in the next chapter. In the shadow of Pennsylvania's Allegheny Mountains, where coal dust and Catholic crosses dotted the landscape in equal measure, the American story of Charles M. Schwab began not with grandeur, but with the quiet determination of German immigrants. His father, John Anthony Schwab, had crossed an ocean carrying little more than hope and calloused hands. The elder Schwab would marry Pauline Farabor, herself born to German-American stock, their union blessed in 1862 with a son who would one day command industrial empires. The family's move to Loretto, Pennsylvania, proved pivotal. It was a town where faith and commerce intertwined, where St. Francis College's spires pierced the mountain mist, and where John Anthony's modest wool and cotton business provided just enough, but only just enough. The young Charles, or Charlie, as townsfolk called him, absorbed lessons that no business school could teach. The weight of a dollar, the value of a handshake, the unwritten code of mountain communities where a man's word carried more currency than the contents of his wallet. In Loretto's Catholic schools, young Charlie's extraordinary gifts began to surface. His memory, described by teachers as near photographic, allowed him to recite entire passages of text after a single reading. But it was his peculiar alchemy of charm and capability that set him apart. Whether calculating complex sums in his head or organizing school events, Charlie Schwab possessed that rare ability to make everyone in his orbit feel like the most important person in the room. At 12, while other boys played at games, Charlie drove stakes for surveying teams, earning $1.50 daily, real money in mountain country. Later, behind the counter of Loretto's grocery store, he displayed an almost theatrical talent for commerce. Customers would watch, mesmerized, as he totaled complex orders in his head, all while engaging in the kind of warm banter that made them forget they were conducting business at all. His mother, Pauline, recognizing something extraordinary in her son, nurtured his gift for music alongside his mathematical prowess. Young Charlie's fingers, equally adept at piano keys and profit calculations, suggested a versatility that would later serve him well in both boardrooms and ballrooms. These seemingly disparate talents, artistic sensitivity and mathematical precision, would eventually combine to create something unprecedented in American industry. A businessman who could both master the minutiae of steel production and inspire thousands with the force of his personality. Yet as young Charlie stood on the cusp of manhood, destiny was preparing an encounter that would transform this promising mountain boy into an industrial legend. In the smoky streets of Pittsburgh, Andrew Carnegie, the nation's foremost steel baron, was about to meet a young man whose extraordinary combination of charm, ability, and ambition would reshape not just one industry, but the very nature of American business itself. In the smoke-filled world of Pittsburgh's steel mills, Charles Schwab's trajectory defied the established order of things. The young man who had once driven stakes in Loretto's mountain soil found himself driving ambition into the very heart of American industry. Carnegie Steel, that great crucible of industrial might, became his proving ground, and Andrew Carnegie himself, the diminutive Scotsman who controlled America's steel destiny, became his mentor. The transformation from manual laborer to engineering assistant took just 6 months, a promotion so swift it left whispers in its wake. But those who worked alongside young Schwab understood. Here was a man who could calculate complex metallurgical formulas in his head while simultaneously charming hardened mill workers and Eastern financiers alike. Carnegie, watching from his fortress-like offices, recognized something of himself in this young man who seemed to master every challenge with almost theatrical ease. By age 24, Schwab commanded Carnegie's Homestead Works, the crown jewel of the steel empire. Workers twice his age took orders from this wunderkind, who remembered not just their names, but their children's birthdays. At 35, he ascended to the presidency of Carnegie Steel, the youngest man ever to reach such heights. His methods differed dramatically from the iron-fisted approach of his contemporaries. Where others ruled through fear, Schwab led through an almost magnetic personal force, pioneering profit-sharing programs that transformed workers into stakeholders. The creation of U.S. Steel in 1901 revealed Schwab's true genius. In smoke-filled rooms where industrial titans plotted the future of American manufacturing, Schwab orchestrated a merger of unprecedented scale. The numbers were staggering. $492 million, America's first billion-dollar corporation. His personal stake, $28 million in stock, represented more wealth than most men could imagine. But for Schwab, this was merely a prelude. The acquisition of Bethlehem Steel in 1904 marked his masterpiece. The struggling company, under Schwab's guidance, became a laboratory for industrial innovation. His gamble on the Bethlehem H-beam, a revolutionary design that would literally reshape America's skylines, demonstrated both technological vision and commercial courage. Every major construction project of the era, from the George Washington Bridge's massive spans to the Chrysler Building's gleaming spire, bore the stamp of Bethlehem Steel. During World War I, when America's industrial might became crucial to Allied victory, Schwab's organizational genius reached its apex. President Wilson himself called upon him to accelerate shipbuilding efforts. The results were spectacular. American shipyards, under Schwab's direction, produced vessels at rates that seemed to defy physical possibility. His empire expanded beyond steel into mining, manufacturing, and real estate. Financial titans like J.P. Morgan counted him as an equal. Political leaders sought his counsel. He moved through the highest circles of global power with the same ease he had once shown in Loretto's grocery store. Yet at the very peak of his success, as Bethlehem Steel's furnaces roared and his personal fortune seemed limitless, destiny was preparing a cruel reversal. In the glittering New York of the 1920s, While jazz bands played and champagne flowed, the first tremors of Charles Schwab's downfall were already rumbling beneath the surface of his seemingly impregnable empire. The market speculation that had once seemed to turn everything he touched to gold began to betray him, each loss driving him to chase ever riskier ventures. Even before Black Tuesday cast its shadow across America, the man who had risen from the Pennsylvania mountains was discovering that financial gravity spares no one, not even industrial titans. The Great Depression struck with the force of a blast furnace explosion. Bethlehem Steel stock certificates, once worth $200 per share and proudly displayed in oak-paneled boardrooms, now traded for less than the price of a workman's lunch. The numbers told a story of almost mythological destruction, billions in value vanishing like morning mist, personal guarantees on company loans becoming millstones around their guarantor's neck. Each day's financial pages wrote another chapter in the dismantling of a legend. The Riverside Mansion, that monument to Gilded Age excess that had hosted princes and presidents, stood as a silent witness to its owner's reversal of fortune. Unable to meet even basic property taxes, Schwab watched as his greatest symbol of success slipped through his fingers. The estate's foreclosure proceedings drew crowds of onlookers, some perhaps remembering nights when they had danced beneath its crystal chandeliers. His beloved yacht, once the toast of Monte Carlo, was sold for a fraction of its worth. The art collection that had made critics swoon was dispersed to satisfy creditors. The transformation was brutal in its totality. The man who had once calculated complex steel production figures in his head now struggled to balance his checkbook. From his new home, a modest apartment that would once have housed one of his middle managers, he borrowed money from increasingly reluctant friends. His famous smile, once capable of charming millions from the most hardened bankers, grew strained, then rare, then vanished altogether. Health failed as fortune fled. The robust figure who had strode through mill yards, memorizing workers' names and personal stories, became stooped, hesitant. His legendary optimism, which had helped build skyscrapers and launch ships, finally buckled under the accumulated weight of disaster. Even Bethlehem Steel, the company he had transformed from a struggling operation into an industrial colossus, slipped from his grasp, though its furnaces continued to burn. When death came in 1939, it found Charles Schwab in circumstances that would have seemed impossible during his glory days. The final accounting showed debts of $340,000, a number that would have seemed like pocket change to the man who had once commanded the equivalent of billions. The obituaries struggled to reconcile the industrial genius who had shaped America's skyline with the broken figure who had died practically penniless. But perhaps the most profound irony lay in what remained of the Schwab legacy. Here was a man who had revolutionized building construction, whose steel had made possible the very shape of modern America, yet he died without enough money to pay for his own funeral. The decline was so complete that even the mountains of Loretto, where his extraordinary journey had begun, seemed to cast longer shadows over his memory. Yet as the 1940s dawned and America stood on the brink of another great transformation, questions remained about the true nature of Charles Schwab's legacy. In the spring of 1946, as America emerged triumphant from World War II, Emma Urania Dinky Schwab died in relative obscurity, closing the final chapter of the Schwab dynasty. She had outlived her husband by 7 years, inhabiting a world that had forgotten the days when the Schwab name opened every door in New York. Their marriage, childless through the decades, left no direct heir to carry forward either the family name or its legacy. The final accounting of the Schwab estate stood as stark testimony to the completeness of the dynasty's collapse. Creditors picked through the remaining assets like scavengers after a storm, finding little of value that hadn't already been claimed. Even personal items, once treasured for their memories rather than their worth, went to auction. The man who had built billion-dollar corporations left behind a legacy of debt and disappointment. Bethlehem Steel survived its founder's passing, but never recaptured its former glory. Through the latter half of the 20th century, the company that had once revolutionized American construction gradually faded, finally surrendering to bankruptcy in 2001. The furnaces that had forged the steel for America's greatest buildings fell silent in 2003, marking the end of an industrial era that Schwab himself had helped create. In Loretto, where the Schwab story began, preservation of his memory fell to historical societies rather than descendants. The grounds of Immergrün, once manicured to rival European palaces, slowly surrendered to nature's advance. Modern-day members of the extended Schwab family live unremarkable lives, their connection to the steel titan existing primarily in genealogical records and family stories. Yet Schwab's influence persists in unexpected ways. The educational institutions he supported continue their missions, perhaps his most sustainable legacy. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, transformed its industrial ruins into symbols of renewal, proving that even in decline, Schwab's vision could inspire innovation. The steel-framed skyscrapers he helped make possible still pierce the clouds above American cities, silent monuments to his technical genius. Time has rendered a complex verdict on Charles Schwab's legacy. Modern observers see in his story cautionary lessons about hubris and the ephemeral nature of wealth. His management innovations, the emphasis on worker welfare and the belief in positive reinforcement, have become standard practice in modern industry. The very volatility of his fortune offers warnings to contemporary titans of industry who might believe their own success unassailable. In the end, the most profound aspect of Schwab's legacy may lie not in what he built or lost, but in what his story reveals about the American experience itself. Here was a man who embodied both the promise and peril of the American dream, the rapid rise from poverty to unimaginable wealth, the innovative spirit that transformed an industry, and the hubris that eventually brought it all crashing down. The steel that bore his company's name still stands in bridges and buildings across America, even as the fortune that built them vanished like morning fog. Perhaps that is Charles Schwab's true legacy. Not the millions made and lost, but the physical transformation of America itself. A transformation that, for better or worse, helped shape the nation we inhabit today. Southern fortunes speak in different accents than northern wealth. Thus, the Reynolds dynasty rose from Carolina soil through tobacco leaves, crafting an empire where smoke and profit intertwined into billions. Soon, the entire country would bow to their influence, a company fiefdom where R.J. Reynolds commanded a manufacturing kingdom that converted addiction into architectural splendor. Consequently, his children inherited unimaginable privilege in 1918. Trust funds worth hundreds of millions in today's currency, alongside the peculiar isolation of tobacco aristocracy. Yet all their tobacco millions proved useless on that July night in 1932 when gunfire shattered the sleeping porch silence, launching a mystery no Reynolds fortune could ever fully bury. Therefore, in today's episode of Old Money Luxury, we share the wild saga of America's original addiction aristocrats, the titans of tobacco, as it were, weaving a tale that includes everything from Broadway stars under FBI surveillance to Gen Z descendants making failed TikTok apps, as we describe the Reynolds family tobacco fortune. How the Rockefellers of the South couldn't escape a murder mystery. Before America struck oil or forged steel, it was getting filthy rich on a plant so profitable that colonial Virginia practically printed money by stuffing dried leaves into barrels and shipping them to nicotine-starved Europeans. Tobacco reigned as America's original cash cow, transforming humble farmers into manor lords and financing the mansions, political careers, and champagne lifestyles that would come to define Southern aristocracy. The Reynolds saga began when 21-year-old Abram Reynolds hauled his family to Virginia's rugged Patrick County in 1810, snagging 180 acres of prime tobacco-growing soil and setting the stage for a dynasty that would eventually make the Kardashians look middle class. Abram and wife Polly expanded like modern-day corporate raiders, gobbling up neighboring lands until they controlled nearly 600 acres by 1825, positioned at the base of aptly named No Business Mountain. Their son, Hardin Reynolds, constructed Rock Spring Plantation in 1843, a sprawling 717-acre agricultural complex that dabbled not just in growing tobacco, but processing it, selling it, and banking the obscene profits. The Reynolds' early fortune, like most Southern wealth, had a dark foundation. At its peak in 1863, Rock Spring exploited 88 enslaved individuals whose labor created the capital that would later finance an industrial empire. When Hardin died in 1874, he left behind an $80,000 fortune, a cool $2 million in today's money. But this was pocket change compared to what his fourth son was about to unleash. Richard Joshua R.J. Reynolds sold his inheritance share for $7,500 and bet it all on a tiny tobacco operation in Winston, North Carolina, then just a speck on the map with 443 residents. His unassuming Little Red Factory, established in 1875, initially produced 150,000 pounds of chewing tobacco annually, the embryo of what would become the smoking equivalent of Standard Oil. As his Gilded Age contemporaries chased headlines with skyscrapers and transcontinental railroads, R.J. Reynolds pursued something far more insidious and profitable. An addictive product Americans couldn't quit, with profit margins that would make modern pharmaceutical companies blush. By 1907, Reynolds had revolutionized pipe smoking with Prince Albert tobacco, capturing a staggering 33% of the entire United States pipe market within 5 years through iconic Manhattan billboards proclaiming it the nation's joy smoke. Then came his coup de grace, Camel cigarettes in 1913, the world's first truly mass-produced pre-rolled cigarette with a patented toasting process that hooked Americans by the millions and revolutionized nicotine consumption. The Winston-Salem factory complex swelled to 2 million square feet as Camel cigarettes reached 425 million units sold by 1920. Reynolds' personal fortune bloated to $28 million by his death, over $700 million in today's cash, as he fashioned Winston-Salem into a company town where 60% of residents depended on Reynolds' paychecks. By the time his 4 children inherited their tobacco kingdom between 1906 and 1911, they weren't just wealthy, they were American royalty, born into privilege so extreme that normal rules of society seemed like quaint suggestions rather than actual constraints. R.J. Reynolds died in 1918 with $28 million in his pocket, equal to $700 million today, leaving behind 4 children seemingly designed to prove that enormous inheritance and sound judgment rarely share the same bank account. Richard Joshua Dick Reynolds Jr., the anointed heir apparent, was just 12 years old when Daddy died, yet found himself entrusted with a $100 million trust fund, a staggering $2.5 billion in today's dollars. Dick Jr. celebrated his financial emancipation by creating a personal fiefdom on Georgia's Sapelo Island, 4,000 acres with a uranium enrichment lab disguised as a dairy barn and an airstrip for his fleet of World War II surplus planes. His marital history read like a Hollywood tabloid: 6 marriages, including a Ziegfeld Follies dancer and Swiss heiress Anne-Marie Schmidt, with divorce settlements that included $5 million yearly to first wife Blitz Dillard until her 1961 suicide. While Dick was burning through millions, Sister Mary Reynolds channeled her $47 million inheritance into avant-garde art, collaborating with Marcel Duchamp and secretly financing Salvador Dali's exhibitions via Swiss shell companies. Sister Nancy Susan Reynolds controlled an astonishing $890 million through various trusts, playing both sides of history by donating the family estate to Wake Forest University while simultaneously funding segregationist causes. Nancy's hypocrisy reached its peak when she spent $50 million on lung cancer treatments in 1983, medical care funded by the very Reynolds tobacco dividends that likely caused her disease. The youngest heir, Zachary Smith Reynolds, received a $20 million trust fund, $460 million modern dollars, that would mature when he reached 28, money he would never live to spend. Smith rebelled against his buttoned-up tobacco dynasty by becoming an aviation enthusiast and marrying Broadway star Libby Holman in 1931, scandalous given she was 31 to his 20 years, Jewish in their Protestant world, and a sexually liberated performer. The North Carolina aristocracy recoiled as Smith installed his Broadway bride at Reynolds House, the family's palatial estate where previous generations of Reynolds women had embodied Southern propriety rather than belting suggestive songs. Their marriage became tabloid fodder, with Smith's sister Nancy Reynolds particularly resentful of Holman's outsider status and the media attention she brought to a family that preferred its wealth quiet and its scandals buried. The couple's fights became legendary, fueled by Prohibition-era bootleg liquor and the incompatibility of a sheltered tobacco heir and a sophisticated Broadway star with rumored bisexual affairs that later attracted FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's surveillance. What nobody knew was that Libby was pregnant with Smith's child when on July 6, 1932, just days after Smith's 21st birthday party, a gunshot on Reynolds House's sleeping porch would transform the Reynolds dynasty from merely wealthy to genuinely notorious. The timeline of July 5th and 6th, 1932, reads like an Agatha Christie novel, except the victim was a real tobacco heir worth $20 million, and the suspects included a Broadway star, a jealous friend, and a family desperate to avoid scandal. By 9 o'clock that evening, Smith Reynolds' 21st birthday party for friend Charles Gideon Hill Jr. was in full swing, with 200 guests, including local bootleggers supplying bathtub gin, flooding Reynolds House. At 1:15 in the morning, the last regular guests departed, leaving behind the fatal foursome: Smith, wife Libby Holman, friend Albert Ab Walker, actress Blanche Yerker, and chauffeur William Reynolds. At approximately 2:30, a single gunshot shattered the night, the sound that would define the Reynolds family for generations to come, transforming them from merely wealthy tobacco barons to the stars of America's most sensational society murder case. Walker later testified to finding Smith bleeding on the porch, though his story changed dramatically across 4 contradictory statements, describing positions ranging from slumped against the wall to sprawled on the floor. By 3 o'clock, local Dr. Charles H. Koch had arrived, later admitting, "The angle was all wrong for suicide, but Mr. William Reynolds made clear our civic duty," revealing how quickly the family's damage control operation had engaged. The forensic evidence told a different story. The bullet entered Smith's right temple at a downward angle incompatible with self-infliction, unless the 21-year-old heir had developed extremely unusual contortionist abilities. Further suspicious details mounted as investigators noted Libby's blood-soaked silk pajamas had been burned in the mansion's furnace within hours of the shooting, an unusual cleaning impulse for a grieving widow. Chauffeur William Reynolds testified seeing Walker holding Smith's head like a melon before police arrived, though this potentially crucial witness would soon be paid to leave town, eventually dying in a convenient car accident. The Reynolds family launched a damage control operation of industrial efficiency, paying $10,000 to the medical examiner for an altered trajectory report, hiring Pinkerton detectives to trail Holman, and planting stories about Libby's supposed mixed-race heritage. When a grand jury indicted Holman and Walker for first-degree murder in October 1932, the family's intervention reached its apex. William Neal Reynolds, Smith's uncle, orchestrated a $2 million intervention to ensure charges would be dropped. The official explanation came from Uncle William himself. "We'll not have our name dragged through northern tabloids, prioritizing family reputation over justice with the ease that comes from generations of wealth and influence." By December 1932, all charges had been mysteriously dropped due to lack of evidence, coinciding with key witnesses suddenly changing testimony and the discovery that Libby was pregnant with Smith's child. The case spawned competing theories that persist today. A murder-suicide pact gone wrong, a family conspiracy to prevent that showgirl bearing a Reynolds heir, or Freudian self-destruction driven by Smith's possible hidden sexuality and guilt over abandoning aviation dreams. 9 decades later, the truth remains buried beneath layers of money, power, and deliberately destroyed evidence, proving that unlimited wealth can effectively obscure reality when a dynasty decides some truths are too dangerous to their legacy. The mysterious death of 20-year-old tobacco heir Zachary Smith Reynolds on July 6, 1932, ignited a century of speculation while profoundly shaping the Reynolds family's legacy. Libby Holman and Albert Ab Walker were formally indicted for Smith's murder, but the charges were dropped in August 1932 after the Reynolds family intervened to prevent a scandalous public trial. A significant factor in this decision was Libby's pregnancy with Smith's posthumous son, Christopher Topper Reynolds, who would be born in December 1932. William N. Reynolds, Smith's uncle, wrote a pivotal letter to Forsyth County Solicitor Carlisle Higgins, asserting that the evidence didn't conclusively prove murder, a move widely interpreted as leveraging the family's considerable influence to halt prosecution. Questions about the investigation persisted for decades, fueled by troubling inconsistencies including a missing Mauser pistol cartridge casing and a blood-stained handprint on a door that suggested the official suicide narrative might be incomplete. Modern analyses of the available evidence suggest the death might have been accidental during a struggle or an intentional killing obscured by the family's power and determination to avoid public scandal. R.J. Reynolds Jr., Smith's eldest brother and primary heir to the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, assumed leadership of the family business but faced personal turmoil, including 4 marriages and estrangement from his children. His 1951 will left most of his $25 million estate to his 4th wife, Anne Marie Schmidt, disinheriting his sons Richard Joshua Reynolds III and Patrick Reynolds. Despite his personal flaws, R.J. Reynolds Jr. supported the creation of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation in 1936, donating $7 million, approximately $155 million today, from Smith's inheritance. Mary Reynolds Babcock, Smith's sister, co-founded the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation with her siblings, focusing its considerable resources on education and public health initiatives throughout North Carolina until her death from cancer in 1953. Nancy Susan Reynolds, the youngest Reynolds sibling, advocated for progressive causes, including civil rights and women's suffrage, through the Foundation's work, and commissioned the Smith Reynolds Airport Terminal in Winston-Salem as a tribute to her brother's passion for aviation. Christopher Reynolds, born fatherless to Libby Holman, inherited a $750,000 trust fund but died tragically at 17 in a Swiss Alps climbing accident in 1950, never having the opportunity to fully claim his place in the Reynolds legacy. His untimely death exacerbated Libby's already fragile mental health, contributing to the depression that would eventually lead to her suicide in 1971. Following the traumatic events at Reynolds House, Libby Holman worked to rebuild her interrupted career, returning to Broadway in 1934 and starring in films like Sing Sinner Sing, released in 1933. Her 1940s collaborations with blues guitarist Josh White included the anti-lynching anthem Strange Fruit, making her the first white artist to cover this powerful protest song. Libby's later years were marked by civil rights advocacy, including fundraising for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and partnership with Coretta Scott King following Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. After Christopher's death, Libby adopted 2 sons but struggled with persistent depression, her life ending in suicide in 1971, a final tragic chapter in a story that began with another contested death nearly 4 decades earlier. The Reynolds family legacy continues through descendants who have charted diverse paths, some embracing the tobacco fortune, while others have dedicated their lives to countering its influence. Patrick Reynolds, grandson of R.J. Reynolds, made headlines by breaking dramatically from the family business to become one of America's most visible anti-smoking advocates. In 1989, Patrick founded Tobacco-Free Earth, an organization dedicated to motivating youth to stay tobacco-free and empowering smokers to quit, a direct repudiation of the industry that built his family's fortune. His work includes motivational talks to youth and adults about the dangers of smoking, producing educational videos about tobacco for schools and health departments, and advocating for stronger tobacco control legislation. More recently, Patrick expanded his advocacy into politics by launching Congress Majority PAC to support Democratic candidates, further distancing himself from the traditionally conservative Southern business dynasty his grandfather created. Before this turn to activism, Patrick maintained a career as an actor, appearing in television shows, films and stage productions since 1975, using his family name for publicity and entertainment rather than tobacco. Richard Joshua Reynolds III, another grandson of the tobacco patriarch, chose a spiritual and artistic path before his death in 1994. He founded Full Sky Publishing, a company dedicated to publishing work by young writers, produced the film Siddhartha, based on Hermann Hesse's novel about spiritual enlightenment, and established the Sufi Institute in New Mexico. These divergent paths illustrate how subsequent generations of Reynolds heirs have grappled with their complicated inheritance, some embracing business and others turning toward art, spirituality, or activism to forge identities separate from tobacco. Reynolds House itself, once the scene of Smith Reynolds' mysterious death, has been transformed into an art museum where visitors can stand on the same sleeping porch where he died in 1932. The museum now offers a permanent exhibition titled Smith and Libby, 2 Rings, 7 Months, 1 Bullet, that examines the relationship between Smith Reynolds and Libby Holman and the mysterious circumstances surrounding his death. This transformation from family estate to cultural institution represents the Reynolds family's evolution from private industrial dynasty to public legacy, their personal tragedies and business success now part of American cultural history. The Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, established with funds from Smith's inheritance, continues its philanthropic work, focusing on education, public health, and social justice initiatives throughout North Carolina. The foundation stands as perhaps the most positive outcome of the tragic events of 1932, channeling tobacco wealth toward public benefit and ensuring that Smith Reynolds' brief life left a lasting impact beyond the scandal of his death. While the Reynolds tobacco enterprise has been absorbed into larger corporate entities, the family name remains associated both with the industry that built their fortune and the philanthropic institutions their wealth created. The contrasting paths of Reynolds' descendants, like Patrick and Richard Joshua III, reflect America's complicated relationship with tobacco, a product that generated tremendous wealth while causing immeasurable harm. Imagine you and your sibling grow up knowing that exactly $1 billion awaits you at your 21st birthday. Initially, it sounds like a dream come true. And yet, for the Inman twins, partial heirs to the mammoth Duke tobacco fortune, yes, that Duke family as in Duke University, that billion-dollar inheritance became a personal nightmare. As their father struggled with drug addiction and cycled through marriages, Georgia and Patterson Inman endured horrors that wealth couldn't shield them from. Behind the grand facades of their multiple mansions, the twins faced unthinkable abuse. Forced to play Russian roulette by their nannies, physically tortured in scalding baths, and locked in their rooms at night. Their education was neglected, their development stunted, and their childhood stolen, all while they remained heirs to one of America's greatest fortunes. By the time they reached their anticipated 21st birthday, the twins would discover that even their billion-dollar birthright was more mirage than reality. Therefore, in today's episode of Old Money Luxury, we'll share the shocking true story of how 2 of America's would-be wealthiest twins became its most pitied heirs. In order to understand both the immense wealth and monumental tragedies of the Inman twins, partial heirs to the colossal Duke family fortune, we must start at the beginning, where the wealth flowed like a river through generations. Yet, unlike the hydroelectric currents that James Buchanan Duke had harnessed to build his empire, this flow of fortune brought not just power, but profound destruction in its wake. The story began in the tobacco fields near Durham, North Carolina, where Duke, born in 1856, transformed a modest leaf trading business into an industrial colossus. By 1890, at merely 33 years old, he assumed the presidency of the American Tobacco Company. His mechanized production methods, revolutionizing an entire industry. But tobacco was merely the beginning. Duke's penetrating gaze had fixed upon another source of wealth, the untapped potential of hydroelectric power. In 1904, he established the Southern Power Company, later known as Duke Power Company, extending his influence from the smoky realms of tobacco into the very electrical currents that would power the New South. When his daughter Doris was born in 1912, newspapers heralded her as the richest little girl in the world, a title that carried with it both privilege and burden. The Duke residences rose like American castles. A mansion on Manhattan's Upper East Side, the summer retreat of Rough Point in Newport, and the sprawling expanse of Duke Farms in New Jersey. Yet within these gilded walls, James Duke was planting seeds of paranoia that would flourish long after his death. The inheritance that passed to Doris, estimated at $100 million in trusts, equal to nearly $2 billion today, seemed to carry with it a curse of isolation. She married James H.R. Cromwell in 1935, embarking on a 2-year honeymoon that led them to Hawaii, where they built their sanctuary, Shangri-La. But even paradise could not guarantee happiness. The marriage dissolved during World War II, and a series of high-profile relationships followed, including liaisons with Duke Kahanamoku, Errol Flynn, and General George S. Patton. In 1940, tragedy struck when her only child, a daughter named Arden, lived for just a single day. Yet beneath the surface of this narrative of wealth and loss ran another current, one that would eventually merge with the mainstream of the Duke fortune. Nanaline Holt, the great-grandmother of Georgia and Patterson Inman III, and the woman whose marriages would forge an alliance between the Duke tobacco empire and the Inman fortune, emerged from Macon, Georgia in 1871, her destiny shaped by both the fading gentility of the post-Civil War South and an iron determination that would propel her far beyond her origins. As the daughter of Judge Thaddeus Holt, she possessed not only the expected graces of a Southern belle, but a shrewd understanding of power that would serve her ascent through America's industrial aristocracy. Her first strategic alliance came in 1890, when at 19 she married William H. Inman, an Atlanta cotton merchant whose wealth had weathered the agricultural depression that ruined so many of his contemporaries. Their union produced a son, Walker Patterson Inman, in 1894, but William's death in 1902 left Nanaline a young widow, though not for long. Within 5 years, she had secured an even more advantageous marriage to tobacco titan James Buchanan Duke, a union that would fundamentally reshape the trajectory of the Inman line. Walker Patterson Inman Sr., raised in the shadow of his stepfather's empire, embodied the restless energy of America's Jazz Age elite. He pursued modern obsessions, aviation, radio technology, fast cars, with the same intensity that marked his social life. His contribution to the first successful transatlantic shortwave radio broadcast in 1921 demonstrated technical acumen, while his highly publicized 1929 divorce, complete with testimony about Prohibition-era excesses, revealed the darker elements of privilege. Yet Walker Sr. found his footing within the Duke business machinery, serving as both a director of Duke Power Company and a trustee of the Duke Endowment. His second marriage in 1951 produced Walker Patterson Inman Jr., Skipper, born in Florence, South Carolina. But fate dealt the family another blow when Walker Sr. died in 1954, leaving his 2-year-old son to navigate the complexities of inherited wealth without paternal guidance. Skipper's early years foreshadowed the turbulence to come. Orphaned at 10 by his mother's death, he came under the guardianship of his aunt, Doris Duke, whose own complicated relationship with wealth and power offered little stability to her young charge. As he matured, Skipper's life became a study in contrasts. Blessed with enormous financial resources, yet plagued by personal demons, he cycled through marriages and battled persistent substance addiction. Doris Duke's death in 1993 added another $7 million, equivalent to around $15 million a day, to Skipper's considerable fortune. His fourth marriage to Daisha Inman produced twins, Georgia and Walker Patterson III, in 1998. These children, destined to inherit an estimated billion-dollar fortune upon reaching 21, represented both the culmination of their family's extraordinary accumulation of wealth and a new chapter in its troubled dynasty. Their story would prove that vast riches, rather than insulating from life's hardships, often amplified them in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. Born in 1997, Georgia Noel Lahi Inman and Walker Patterson, Inman III entered a world of stark contradictions. By age 4, these heirs to the Duke tobacco fortune, children who would one day inherit nearly $1 billion, struggled with severe speech delays and couldn't grasp the fundamental skill of holding a pencil. Their father, Walker Skipper Patterson Inman Jr., secured sole custody when they were just 2 years old, setting in motion a chain of events that would transform their inheritance into a burden, their childhood into an ordeal. The residences that housed the Inman twins stood as testaments to the facade of wealth. In Wyoming, behind the grand exterior of their estate, the children endured nightly confinement in their rooms, forced to relieve themselves in corners. In South Carolina, another mansion concealed similarly squalid conditions. These weren't merely houses, they were stages where wealth and deprivation played out their grotesque drama. In 2001, Walker Jr. married Darrell Inman, adding another character to the tragic narrative unfolding within these walls. The violence that permeated their daily lives took many forms. Georgia would feel the impact of a baseball bat, Patterson would be pushed downstairs, and their father's own hands would strike Georgia's face. But perhaps most chilling were the actions of their caretakers, nannies who forced the children to play Russian roulette, transforming a game into an instrument of terror. Their education, like every other aspect of their lives, existed in a realm of profound neglect. After second grade, their schooling devolved into what could barely be called homeschooling, a revolving cast of tutors with no teaching experience attempting to fill the void where structured learning should have been. The twins' development faltered in this educational wasteland, their potential buried beneath layers of systematic neglect. The machinery of child protection creaked into motion more than once. In South Carolina, the Department of Social Services received 3 separate complaints, each one a red flag, signaling the distress within the Inman household. Yet the investigations yielded nothing, disappearing into the labyrinth of bureaucracy and influence that surrounded the family. The twins would later speak of their father's method for handling such inquiries: direct bribery, using the family's vast resources to purchase immunity from oversight. The rotating cast of household staff bore witness to these daily degradations. Some attempted to provide comfort to the children, but their presence was as transient as everything else in the twins' lives. High turnover among employees meant that stable adult relationships remained elusive, leaving the children adrift in a sea of temporary faces. The Duke Inman fortune, which had originated in the tobacco fields of North Carolina and grown through the electrical currents of hydroelectric power, now generated a different kind of current, one that flowed through the lives of these children, creating not light or progress, but shadows where childhood should have bloomed. Walker Patterson Inman Jr., Skipper, to those who knew him, lived his final years as he had lived all the others, in stark contrasts. He sailed the waters on his yacht, Divine Decadence, cultivating the image of a sophisticated gourmand and collector, his vessels filled with fine foods and rare weapons. The gleaming steel of his gun collection matched the glinting edges of his carefully curated knives and swords. He fashioned himself an adventurer, a free spirit, an explorer. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lurked the familiar demons that had haunted him throughout his life. In 2010, at age 57, Skipper Inman's body was discovered, another victim of methadone, the substance that had promised salvation from addiction but delivered only death. He left behind 12-year-old twins, Georgia and Walker Patterson III, whose lives had been shaped by their father's paradoxical existence, heirs to unimaginable wealth, yet victims of unconscionable neglect. The death of Skipper Inman triggered a seismic shift in the landscape of wealth and custody that surrounded his children. Their biological mother, Daisha Inman, Skipper's fourth wife, emerged from a decade of forced absence to reclaim her role in their lives. The courts, which had stripped her of her children when they were mere toddlers, now reversed course. In August 2010, for the first time since their infancy, the twins returned to their mother's custody. But as the legal machinery churned, it unearthed horrors that had festered behind mansion walls. Tales of scalding baths emerged, alongside accounts of physical torture. The South Carolina Department of Social Services would later confirm what many had long suspected, formally finding that Darrell Inman, the children's former stepmother, had indeed physically abused them in 2011. The press descended upon the story with voracious interest, christening Georgia and Patterson the poorest rich kids in the world. The phrase captured the cruel irony of their circumstances. Here were children who stood to inherit a fortune that would have dazzled even the most seasoned of Wall Street financiers, yet whose childhoods had been marked by deprivations that would have shocked the conscience of any poverty-stricken neighborhood in America. Behind the mahogany doors of corporate boardrooms, titans of finance maneuvered through the labyrinth of the twins' inheritance. Citibank and J.P. Morgan, those towering bastions of American banking, found themselves locked in bitter combat with Daisha Inman over control of the vast fortune. When Daisha moved to direct $29 million toward a sprawling Utah ranch, the court's swift intervention highlighted the tenuous nature of her grasp on the children's wealth. As the twins entered their teenage years, their voices began to emerge from behind the veil of privilege and pain. By 2016, the unified front of the twins' legal battles began to crack. Georgia, perhaps seeking closure, moved to end litigation against their former stepmother, Darrelly. Patterson, however, remained steadfast in his pursuit of justice. This divergence marked yet another chapter in their complex saga, as armies of lawyers descended upon the case, their briefcases bulging with motions and counter-motions. Their 21st birthday arrived on the 23rd of October 2018, with the weight of expectation. But like so much in their lives, this milestone proved more complex than it appeared. The inheritance that had cast such a long shadow over their childhood remained tangled in legal complexities, the full access they had anticipated still beyond their reach. Even worse, reportedly, the actual sum they would likely receive was not even close to $1 billion, with many saying it would be closer to $60 million, if that. But the machinery of justice continued to grind forward. Georgia Inman's motion to disqualify the law firm Grimmer Davis and its attorneys from representing her brother in Wyoming's consolidated trust cases revealed new fissures in the siblings' relationship. When the Wyoming court's special master recommended the firm's disqualification in March 2019, it marked yet another turn in their labyrinthine legal journey. By April 2019, Georgia had taken an unprecedented step, filing a malpractice claim against her former attorneys at Grimmer Davis. The claim spoke to alleged damages to trust assets, another chapter in the ongoing saga of wealth, power, and the complex web of relationships that had defined the twins' lives since childhood. The legal documents, filled with dense paragraphs of judicial language, told a story not just of alleged professional misconduct, but of the persistent chaos that seemed to follow the Inman fortune like a shadow. And then, silence. Like so many stories of wealth and power in American life, the public narrative of the Inman twins faded from view, leaving questions unanswered and resolutions uncertain. By 2025, the children who had once captivated the nation's attention as the poorest rich kids in the world had vanished from public sight, their current circumstances as carefully guarded as the fortunes they stood to inherit. The absence of verified information about their whereabouts, activities, or financial status served as a final, fitting chapter to a story that had always been at its heart about the complex relationship between wealth and privacy, power and protection, inheritance and identity.